The lantern burns low and steady, its flame barely moving in air that has forgotten how to be restless. She sits on the edge of the narrow bed, her wool blanket pulled around her shoulders, a leather-bound journal open across her knees. She is not reading. She has already read every word inside it, more than once, and now she holds it the way you hold something that has answered a question you spent years not knowing how to ask. Outside, beyond the stone wall at her back, the cliff drops away into the gorge. Beyond the gorge, the mountain. Beyond the mountain, a world that does not know she is here. That is the point. That has always been the point. The waterfall is loud tonight. When the temperature drops below a certain threshold, it changes pitch. Lower, heavier, less like water and more like weather. Like a sound the earth is making for its own reasons. She has learned to hear the difference. She has learned a great many differences since the first night she lay on this same bed, and listened to that same sound, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from exhaustion and relief, arriving at the same moment, that she did not need to move again tonight. There is frost on the cliff face outside. She can see it when she holds the lantern near the gap beside the doorframe, a thin, bright crust along the stone, feathering out from the cracks where moisture seeps through from above. By morning it will have spread further. By next week it will be winter in earnest, and the gorge will be impassable. And no one will come looking for anything up here because no one, as far as she has been able to determine, knows there is anything up here to find. She sets the journal on the crate beside the bed. She adjusts the lantern. She draws the blanket tighter. 2 blankets now, the original 2 she found on arrival, plus 1 she carried back from town on her 4th trip out, bundled under one arm, and traded for an afternoon's work stacking feed sacks at the store. The hearth has been burning since mid-afternoon, and the hut is warm in the specific, dense way that only stone holds warmth, radiating it back slowly, steadily, long after the fire has settled to coals. This is hers, not legally, not on paper, but in the way that matters first and most, in the way that the body understands before the mind catches up. This place has become hers. She thinks sometimes about the morning she found it, about the storm that drove her into the gorge, about the particular angle of desperation that made her keep moving when every reasonable instinct said stop, sit down, wait it out. She did not stop. She kept moving toward the sound of water, and the water led her here. But that is getting ahead of things. To understand where she is now, you have to go back to the rain. The rain that would change everything began as a color. She noticed it first in the sky above the eastern ridge. Not clouds exactly, but a bruising, a slow suffusion of greenish-gray, spreading behind the peaks, like something spilled beneath thin paper. She had been walking since early morning. The man who'd given her a ride from the highway junction had let her out at a crossroads marked by a leaning wooden post and a sign she couldn't fully read, one arm of it broken and rotated down toward the earth, as if pointing at something buried. He hadn't said much. She hadn't asked him to. She was 19 years old, and she had learned, by then, not to ask for more than was offered. The trail she'd chosen ran north, along a creek drainage, climbing gradually toward a pass marked on her paper map with a thin dotted line. The kind of line that means possible route, not reliable road. She'd been following those dotted lines for over a year. Since 18, since the last foster placement had expired like a lease no one intended to renew. Since she'd understood that the system that had held her, loosely, imperfectly, sometimes unkindly, since she was 12 years old, had finally finished with her. Released her, was the word they used. She had always thought that was a strange word for it. Released suggested something that had been straining to go free. She had not been straining. She had simply been waiting, the way she always waited. Quietly, practically, without making herself a problem, until the waiting stopped being an option. The canvas pack on her shoulders held everything she owned, a wool blanket rolled tight and lashed with a short cord. A folding knife with a blade she kept clean. A flashlight with batteries she knew were fading. A road map folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth. $11 in mixed bills and coins. Tucked into a zippered interior pocket she checked with her hand every few hours out of habit. She was not panicking. That was the thing people would not have understood if there had been anyone watching. She was not frightened or defeated or lost in any way that felt catastrophic. She was simply in motion, following the logic of forward, because forward was the only direction she had ever fully trusted. Behind her was everything that hadn't worked. Ahead was the pass, and beyond the pass, maybe a valley, maybe a town, maybe a few days of work and a floor to sleep on before she moved again. That was the shape of her life. That was what she knew. The sky above the ridge deepened another shade. The wind came off the high ground, carrying cold. She felt through her jacket, like a hand pressing flat against her sternum. The first drops arrived, not as rain but as a kind of announcement, sparse and deliberate, the way a sound sometimes begins before you realize it has already been building for a long time. She kept walking. The rain came all at once. Not a progression, not the slow escalation she might have braced against, but a sudden erasure, as though the mountain had simply decided. One moment the trail was visible, gray stone and mud and wet pine needles pressed flat, and the next moment there was only water, sheeting down the gorge walls, hammering the ground, filling the air between the surfaces so completely that looking ahead was like looking into a mirror held too close. She pulled her jacket tighter across her chest and kept moving, but the trail beneath her boots had already begun to change. The mud loosened from the edges first, then the center, then everything at once, the whole surface of the path softening and spreading until it was less a trail than a suggestion of one, a memory of direction absorbed into the noise. She lost it somewhere between one step and the next. She could not have said exactly when it happened. The gorge walls were close. That much she could feel, even when she couldn't see them clearly. The air pressure changing slightly when she drifted toward the rock. The way sound bounced back differently from a solid surface than from open space. She used this. She put her left hand against the cliff face and kept it there. Stone, wet and cold and certain. The one thing in her immediate world that did not shift or blur. She moved along it, the way you might feel your way through a dark room you have never been in before. Slowly, deliberately, trusting the solid thing. The roar around her was enormous. Rain and wind had merged into something nearly indistinguishable from white noise, filling every register of hearing, flattening all other information. She was working hard just to process it, to listen through the undifferentiated noise for anything that carried direction or meaning. She felt the cold moving up from her hands into her forearms. Her boots had soaked through within the first few minutes. The $11 in her interior pocket was the last warm thing she was aware of, and even that was probably an illusion. And then, under the rain, under the wind, present and regular, where nothing else was regular, she heard it. Water. But not the rain. A different sound entirely, lower and more continuous. A sound with depth and consistency. A sound that came from a fixed place. A waterfall, somewhere ahead and below, and to her left, behind the gorge wall's curve. She didn't think. That was what would matter, later, when she looked back at this moment, from across a distance she hadn't yet crossed. She didn't reason through it, or calculate the risk. She simply oriented toward the sound the way a compass needle orients toward north. Not by choice exactly, but by something older and more reliable than choice. Her hand stayed flat against the cliff. Her feet kept moving. The sound grew. The rock was cold enough to hurt. She pressed forward anyway. The water hit her before she expected it. She had edged along the gorge wall toward the sound, hand still pressed flat against the stone, and the ground had narrowed to almost nothing. a ledge barely wide enough for her boots placed sideways. And then the waterfall was simply there, a white curtain dropping from somewhere above her in the dark, close enough to touch. The spray reached her first, a fine, cold mist that coated her face and hands and drove the temperature down another few degrees. She stood for a moment, breathing through it. Then she understood that the ledge continued behind the falling water, that the cliff did not stop at the waterfall, but curved inward on the other side of it, and that the only way forward was through. She went through. It was 3 seconds, maybe 4. The water came down across her shoulders and the back of her neck and drove the air out of her, and she could not see and could not hear anything except the roar of it pressing against every surface of her skull. Her boots found purchase on wet stone, and she moved sideways and pressed herself against the rock, and then she was through, gasping, blinking water from her eyes, shaking hard enough that her teeth knocked together once before she clenched them. She was standing on a dry ledge. There was a door in the cliff. Not a natural opening. A door, timber-framed, low, set directly into the stone face of the gorge wall, with a hand-forged iron latch that had gone the color of old rust. The wall around it was cut stone, fitted stone, the kind of work that required a person with skill and time and intention. The waterfall fell 6 feet to her left, and its noise was everywhere, but where she stood, the air was still. She lifted the latch. The door swung inward. The dark inside the hut was different from the dark of the gorge. It was a contained dark, a settled dark. She stood in the doorway for a long moment while her eyes adjusted, and the shapes came forward slowly. A narrow bed frame of salvaged timber against the far wall. A cast-iron wood stove to her right, with a short stovepipe running up and through the stone. 2 lanterns hanging from an iron hook rack beside the door. A wooden crate on the floor. A low ceiling of timber and fitted stone above all of it. A floor that was dry. She did not stand there long. She was too cold for wonder. She found the wood stove's door by touch. The small stack of firewood beside it was dry, genuinely dry. Not surface dry, but dry all the way through, the way wood gets when it has been sheltered for a long time. She found matches in the tin on top of the crate. Her hands shook badly on the first 2 strikes. The third one caught. She closed the stove door. She sat down on the floor in front of it. She waited for the heat to begin. She slept in her clothes with both wool blankets pulled over her, and did not move until light came through the gaps in the timber roof. Thin, pale lines of it, the gray-white of overcast morning. She lay still for a moment and listened. The waterfall was constant. It had been constant through the night, and she had slept through it the way you sleep through a familiar sound, one that your body decides is safe. That told her something. She sat up. The stove had gone cold, but the hut had held more warmth than she expected from stone, and her breath only barely showed. She fed the fire again from the remaining wood, moving carefully, measuring what she had against what she might need. Then she turned around and looked at everything in full daylight for the first time. She began at the door and moved clockwise. That was how she did it, methodically, left to right, close to far, floor to ceiling, because she had learned long ago that the mind under stress skips things, and skipped things cost you. The hook rack beside the door held the 2 lanterns. She lifted each one, shook it gently. Both had oil. Not much, perhaps 1/3 of a reservoir each, but enough. She set them back. The wooden crate yielded. A hatchet with a sound handle. A handsaw with a blade that had surface rust but still had tooth. A coil of rope, hemp, stiff but unrotted, and a tin of mixed hardware. She sorted the hardware into her palm. Nails of 3 different sizes, 2 eye bolts, a handful of wood screws, a short length of wire. She put them back precisely. The 2 wool blankets she laid across the bed frame and pressed her hands through them, checking for rot, for wet, for the softness that means mildew has eaten the fiber. They were sound, old but sound. The bed frame itself was timber, salvaged pieces, not milled uniform, joined with hand-cut notches and wooden pegs. Someone had put real thought into it. She ran her thumb along a joint and felt how tight it still was, after however many years. She examined the walls next, section by section, where the stone was solid, where the mortar had crumbled and would need attention, where the fitted stone met the cliff face at the back, and the seam was still weather-tight. She noted the stovepipe's path through the roof, how the surrounding stone had been shaped to accommodate it, how well that shaping had held. She swept the floor last, using a cedar branch she had brought in from the gorge ledge, moving the debris toward the door in careful rows. It was in sweeping that she found it, the edge of something darker than the floorboards, protruding from beneath the bed frame. She set the branch down.
She knelt.
She worked it free with both hands, careful not to force it. It was a journal, leather-bound, small enough to hold in one palm. She did not open it yet. She did not open it that evening. She set it on the crate beside the lantern and left it there. She had learned, over years of moving through other people's spaces, shelters, barns, abandoned houses where someone else's life had clearly been, that some things deserved a pause before you touched them fully. The journal was dry. It had survived however long it had survived. One more night would not harm it, and rushing felt wrong, in a way she could not precisely articulate. The first evening she read it, the rain had returned. Lighter now, a steady drizzle rather than a fury, and the waterfall had thickened again to its full curtain. She sat on the bed frame with the blanket around her shoulders and the lantern close, and she opened the cover. The handwriting was careful, not elegant, not the handwriting of someone who had spent much time at a desk, but deliberate. Each letter formed completely before the next began, as though the writer had learned to write the same way he had learned everything else, by paying close attention and not rushing. The entries were short, dates first, then observations. The quality of the stone in a particular section of the gorge wall, how the light moved through the water at different hours, how long it took to set a single course of stone when working alone, with no one to hold the opposite end. There were no complaints in the entries, but there were precise descriptions of difficulty, of cold mornings, of a hand injured and wrapped, and still used because stopping was not practical, of days when the stone resisted and had to be approached differently. He wrote about the gorge as though it were a presence he respected. He wrote about the hut's construction the way someone might describe a long conversation, something worked out gradually, not declared. He had come here, she understood, not to hide from the world exactly, but to find a version of the world that was the right size for him. She read slowly across 2 evenings, resting when her eyes grew tired, returning when the lamp had been refilled. Near the middle of the journal, he had written a single entry that she returned to more than once. He had written that he did not build things to leave a mark. He built because building was the closest he came to understanding what he was supposed to be doing with the years he had been given. When a wall stood plumb and tight against the weather, he felt that he had, for that moment, answered a question he couldn't put into words. She sat with that for a long time. She did not name what she recognized in it. She was 19 years old and had not yet learned that recognition doesn't always require language, that sometimes you simply feel the shape of a thing from the inside, and that is sufficient. She closed the journal carefully. She set it on the crate. Outside, the water fell without ceasing. She woke before the light changed behind the water, which meant she woke in the same gray dark she had fallen asleep in, and for a moment she did not know how long she had been there. She counted backwards. 4 days. She lay still and listened. The water fell the same as always, but beneath it, or rather behind it, she was beginning to understand the acoustics of the place. There was a different quality to the air. The drumming on the cliff above had stopped. The storm had moved on in the night. She rose and stood at the edge of the waterfall's curtain, looking out into the gorge. The light was thin and new, and the rocks were dark with wet. But the sky beyond the canyon walls held a pale, washed brightness that had not been there before. She pressed the back of her hand into the falling water, and felt the cold of it, clean and indifferent. The world had resumed. She ate the last of a tin she had opened the previous morning. She drank. Then she looked up. The roof. She had known about the two rotted boards since her second night, when she had felt the draft and traced it with her palm to the far corner of the timber ceiling. She had not addressed it yet, because she had been cold and tired, and the damage was not catastrophic. Now she looked at it differently. Now she was not surviving the night. She was planning the next week. She moved the bed frame clear of the corner and used the rope from the crate to lash 2 pieces of cut branch to the crossbeam as a makeshift brace while she worked. She pried the rotted boards away with the hatchet blade, working carefully so she did not widen the damage, and examined what was underneath. The structure was sound. The rot had been surface, seasonal, water finding its way in over years and softening the outer layer while the frame held. She replaced the boards with sections she found in the rear of the hut, boards she had noticed stacked behind the crate and assumed were spare, which apparently they were. The fit was not perfect, but it was solid. She sealed the gaps with strips of bark, tamped in tight with the flat of the knife handle. She rehung the iron hook rack after that. One of the wall anchors had crumbled. She packed the cavity with a mixture of damp clay from the gorge and small stone chips, let it cure, and reset the hook. By the time she finished, the rack held. She tested it with her full weight on both hands. It held. The wood stove flue she cleared last, using a length of rope weighted at one end, dropping it down from the short chimney pipe above, and pulling it through twice. A quantity of debris came loose. She swept it out, laid a small fire, and lit it. The smoke drew cleanly up and out, and she did not realize she had made a decision until she stepped back and looked at what she had done. The fire drew well, that was enough, for that night. She slept without deciding to sleep, lay down on the timber frame with both blankets pulled over her, and was gone before the small fire had finished settling into coals. When she woke, the hut was cold and gray, with morning light diffusing through the waterfall's curtain, and she lay still for a moment, listening to that sound, the way she had learned to listen to it, not as noise, but as a kind of assurance. The water was still falling. The world outside was still outside. She had $11 when she arrived. She had spent nothing. That would change today. The trail out of the gorge took her upward along the eastern wall, through a gap she had mapped in her own mind over the preceding days, marking it the way she marked everything, by landmark, by feel, by the way the light moved. 6 miles to town by trail. She had confirmed this against the paper road map, which placed the nearest settlement 14 miles by the only road but considerably closer through the ridgeline route. She took the trail. It was cold. The leaves on the hardwoods had gone full amber, and the ground was beginning to stiffen in the mornings. She walked quickly, her canvas pack on her back, lighter than it had been in weeks because she had left the wool blanket behind. That felt deliberate. That felt like something. The town was small enough that it declared itself before she fully arrived. A water tower, a grain elevator, a steeple. Population under 400. She had seen towns like this her whole life, and knew how to move through them, quietly, without drawing attention, without giving anyone a reason to ask questions she could not answer yet. She bought a box of matches, a small tin of lard, a sleeve of crackers, and a length of candle wick at the feed store. $4 and change. She asked nothing and volunteered nothing, and the man behind the counter was indifferent in the way that small-town merchants could be with strangers in October, when the summer people were long gone. The library was 2 rooms in a converted house on the main street. A woman was shelving books near the back. She did not look up. The county land use maps were filed in a wide, flat drawer beneath the reference shelves. Oversized sheets, folded and labeled by section and year. She found the gorge parcel within 20 minutes. The topographic lines were dense where the cliff dropped, and she recognized the shape of the land the way she recognized a face she had studied for weeks. The parcel was listed under a family name, recorded 1927, last recorded transfer, 1959, no subsequent activity, no tax liens, no development filings, nothing. She wrote the family name on the back of the road map in pencil, small and neat, and folded it away. She had not spoken to a single person about what she had found. She was not ready. She was still learning the shape of it. She carried the wax and the candle wick back through 6 miles of trail in the early afternoon light, and when she slipped behind the waterfall and ducked into the stone hut, she stood still for a moment in the dimness and understood something she had not quite articulated before. It looked like a place someone had left. She needed it to look like a place someone had returned to. She started with the floor. The stone was cold and uneven, beautiful in the way old things could be beautiful. Each slab fitted by hand, the mortar between them darkened with decades of moisture and use. But bare stone in the morning turned her feet numb within minutes, and she had no tolerance left for cold she could prevent. She went out into the gorge and worked along the slope above the waterfall, pulling pine boughs from the lower branches, not stripping any single tree, moving from one to the next, taking only what each could spare. She carried them back in armloads, shaking the water from them, and wove the branches together on the floor, the way she had once seen someone weave a basket, overlapping the stems until the mat held its own shape. It was rough and imperfect, and smelled like resin and rain, and when she stood on it, her feet stayed warm. The bed came next. The frame was sound, good timber, properly joined, but the sleeping surface was nothing more than rope lacing that had gone soft and slack, and what she laid on it had shifted in the night and left her aching. She had found a feed sack near the trail 2 days before, half buried under leaf litter, canvas and still intact, printed with the name of an agricultural cooperative that had probably been closed since before she was born. She dragged it inside and spent an hour gathering dry leaves from under the rock overhang at the gorge's upper edge, where the rain never fully reached. She stuffed the sack until it was dense and even, stitched the open end closed with a length of twine from the crate, and laid it across the rope lacing. It was not a mattress. It was something better than nothing, which was a category she had learned to value above almost everything else. The firewood took the rest of the afternoon. She worked until her shoulders ached, and the light behind the waterfall had gone from silver to gray. The stack grew along the interior wall, split pieces, stacked bark down, the way the hut's original builder had stacked them, protected from the draft that crept under the door. By the time she set the hatchet down, she had enough to last 2 weeks without rationing. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at what she had made. It looked inhabited. It looked intentional. It looked for the first time like it was waiting for her to stay. She waited 3 days before going back to town. Not because she was afraid exactly, because she needed to know what she was walking toward before she walked toward it. The journal had given her a name. The name had given her a direction. But directions, she had learned, were not the same as destinations, and she was not willing to arrive at something half-prepared. She read the journal twice more. The stonemason had been a careful, private man, his entries brief, almost architectural in their plainness. He wrote about stone the way other men wrote about weather, with attention, with respect, with the understanding that it would outlast him. He had built the hut over 2 summers, hauling material from the gorge walls themselves, fitting each piece by hand. He had not intended it as a secret. He had simply not told anyone, and no one had asked. She left before dawn on the 4th morning, taking the trail by feel in the early dark, and reaching the road while the sky was still pale. The town was 6 miles of ridge and switchback, and she walked it in just over 2 hours. The county records office was in the back of a building that also housed the post office and a room that appeared to be used for neither purpose. A woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck helped her without asking why she wanted to know. The land deed was in a ledger, filed under a name that matched the journal exactly. The parcel, 11 acres straddling the gorge, had transferred once, in 1961, 2 years after the stonemason's death. The new owner was listed as a son. A marginal notation in a different ink, added later, listed a grandson as current holder of record. The address given was a rural route number in the same county. She wrote it all down on a page torn from the back of a grocery receipt she found in her jacket pocket. She thanked the woman and walked to the library. The library's local history section was 2 shelves and a box of photocopied newsletters from the County Historical Society. The stonemason appeared in 3 of them, once in a photograph of a church restoration completed in 1938, once in a brief obituary that said very little, and once in a list of craftsmen who had worked on a stone bridge that no longer stood. He had been, by all accounts, a man who made things that outlasted the memory of their making. She sat with those newsletters until the light outside the windows went amber and the librarian began moving quietly between shelves, the way librarians do when they are too polite to ask you to leave. She walked back in the dark. The trail was familiar enough now that she did not need the flashlight. She walked and thought about what it meant to find someone and what it meant to be found. The rural route address led her to a small house set back from the road behind a windbreak of old spruce trees. White paint, green shutters, a woodpile stacked with the precision of someone who had been doing it the same careful way for decades. She stood at the end of the driveway for a moment before walking up. He answered the door before she knocked a second time. He was in his 70s, she guessed, a lean man with steady eyes and the broad, deliberate hands of someone who had worked with them his whole life. He looked at her the way people in small towns sometimes look at strangers, not unkindly, but completely. She told him who she was. She told him what she had found. She kept it plain and factual. The gorge, the waterfall, the hut built into the cliff, the stove, the blankets, the tools. She told him about the journal. She drew the leather-bound book from her pack and held it out to him, not releasing it yet, just letting him see it was real. He was quiet for a long time. He did not invite her in immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked at the journal the way a person looks at something they were not prepared to feel anything about, and then suddenly did. She waited. The wind moved through the spruce trees behind her. Finally, he said, his grandfather had been a man who kept to himself. The family had known that. They had not always understood it. She told him she wanted to stay through the winter. She told him she would care for the place, maintain the roof, keep the hearth clean, do nothing to damage or alter what was already there. She told him she would leave in the spring if he asked her to. No argument. He was quiet again. Then he said, his grandfather would have approved of someone who found it the hard way. She understood that this was his answer. He reached out and took the journal from her hands. He held it carefully, both hands, the way you hold something you are not sure will survive being touched. He told her he would read it and return it to her. She nodded. That felt right. It should stay in the hut. It belonged to the place more than it belonged to either of them. They did not shake hands. There was a small nod, the kind that means more than the gesture itself. She thanked him. He said she was welcome, and she could hear that he meant something larger by it than the word usually carried. She walked back down the driveway and onto the road. The spruce trees stood dark and still behind her. 6 miles of trail between her and the sound of falling water. The journal came back 3 days later. She found it propped against the outside edge of the waterfall's curtain, wrapped in oilcloth, weighted with a flat stone so the wind off the gorge would not take it. He must have walked the trail himself, or sent someone who knew the land. She did not know which, and did not try to find out. The oilcloth was tied with a piece of twine. Tucked beneath the knot was a folded square of paper, 4 words in a careful, elderly hand. "Leave the door open." She understood him. Not the literal instruction. The hut had no door to speak of, only a frame she had rehung with salvaged timber, but the spirit of it. Leave room for the place to breathe. Leave room for what it had already been. She tucked the note into the front cover of the journal and returned both to their place beneath the bed frame, in the shallow hollow where the stonemason had kept them for 53 years. The floor there was cold and the stone smooth. She pressed the journal flat and left it. That evening she lit both lanterns, not for warmth, the hearth held that, but because she wanted to see the room fully. The stone walls with their careful mortar, the iron hook rack with her canvas pack, and her wool blanket hanging beside the lantern she had cleaned and refilled 6 weeks earlier. The wood stove radiating steady heat. The bed with its newer boards replacing the ones that had failed. The crate of tools, hatchet, handsaw, rope, the tin of mixed hardware, sitting exactly where she had first found them, because there was no reason to move them. Everything in its place. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at all of it. Outside, the waterfall ran. It had been running since before the stonemason cut the first stone, and it would be running long after both of them were gone. It did not care about any of this. It was not a witness. It was simply water, falling because the mountain gave it no other direction to go. But it was also the reason this room existed, the reason she had found it, the reason she was sitting here now, in the warmth and the lantern light, with a bed beneath her, and a roof overhead, and a larder stocked against the winter. 19 years old. She had been moving since she was old enough to understand that no one was coming to tell her where to stop. She was still now. The lantern flame steadied in the quiet air. The stone walls held their warmth. The waterfall spoke in its continuous, unhurried voice just beyond the threshold, and she sat inside it, known to this place, belonging to it, finally, unmistakably, home.